Okay, this is going to be a longer form presentation. Basically, I'm going to roll through Jim Rickards and some of his older work. If you haven't heard of him, I'll put the link below in this particular video. But I'll play through this one and add some commentary along the way. And then I'll jump into briefly the current, as at the 15th of June 2022, how the markets are looking. All right, let's go.
After 9/11, the CIA launched Project Prophecy. Its mission was to detect imminent threats to the United States from terrorists, hostile nations, and from weaknesses lurking inside our economy. On August 7, 2006, Prophecy's system uncovered warning signs of an impending terrorist attack. 3 days later in London, a plot to blow up 10 U.S. passenger jets was thwarted, and 24 Pakistani extremists were arrested. In 2007, Prophecy spotted a fast-approaching crash in our real estate and stock markets. Intelligence community officials presented their findings to the Treasury, who ignored the warnings. What happened next was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. In recent years, Prophecy has been used by the Pentagon to ready our defenses in the event of an economic weapon of...
I'm curious what signals are being sent out at the moment with the current market conditions going pretty low.
Mass destruction being detonated in our financial markets. Unfortunately, the architect of the CIA's Project Prophecy has now come forward to warn the public that America is about to suffer a $100 trillion collapse. In the following interview, he revealed...
This is back in 2014, I believe, so well ahead of their time, and a lot of quantitative easing has taken place since then also. Remembering 2008, 2009, when it all began, Bitcoin too.
Reveals why this outcome is unavoidable. Viewer discretion is advised.
My name is Steve Myers, and I want to thank you for taking part in this exclusive Monday morning interview with Jim Rickards, the financial threat and asymmetric warfare advisor for both the Pentagon and CIA. Recently, all 16 branches of our intelligence community have come together to release a shocking briefing that contained an alarming consensus. These agencies, that include the CIA, FBI, Army, and Navy, they've already begun to estimate the impact of the fall of the dollar as the global reserve currency.
This is fascinating. This was, again, back in 2013, 2014. Currently, you see what this alludes to, I believe, and where I think we are currently in the market. Given the mass pullbacks, given the quantitative tightening taking place, the Fed having no choice but to raise rates and therefore bringing on a self-induced recession, to which I'm not sure there's a way out of.
And our reign as the world's leading superpower being annihilated in a way equivalent to the end of the British Empire post-World War II. And the endgame could be a nightmarish scenario where the world falls into an extended period of global...
Now, this is what I'm talking about. It sounds like a bit of fear porn, prepper doomsday sort of stuff. But in all honesty, watching the financial markets unfold the way they have been, the unfiltered allowance of quantitative easing to continuously print up that money, continuously deflate the currency. I mean, there's other people in this community that probably also are aware of this and can see the troubling times ahead. Not necessarily for Hex cryptocurrency, but if, you know, the cryptocurrency market is down and there's an extended period of global anarchy, maybe cryptocurrency may be able to provide something that did not once exist. All right, we'll keep going.
Anarchy. Jim Rickards fears he and his colleagues' warnings are being ignored by our political leaders and the Federal Reserve, and we're on the verge of entering the darkest economic period in our nation's history, one that will ignite a 25-year Great Depression. Today, we're going to examine everything he's
This analysis was conducted before quantitative tightening began, before the virus that we can't even speak about on this particular channel, and with energy prices more under control, I guess you'd call it. There was better shipping supplies because of the how can I word it? There was less shortages coming out of China because of the virus, basically. All right, I'll continue.
Covered, because the bedlam could begin within the next 6 months, which is why every American should hear his warnings before it's too late. Jim Rickards, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Steve. Glad to be with you.
In the early 80s, you were a member of the team that helped negotiate an end to the Iran hostage crisis. In the late 90s, when it was discovered that the Wall Street firm Long-Term Capital Management was about to cause a total collapse of the financial markets, the Federal Reserve had to turn to you in order to stop this catastrophe from plunging America into a recession. And then, after 9/11, you were tasked by the CIA with investigating potential insider trading that took place prior to the terrorist attacks.
That's exactly right. The problem was the CIA didn't have any capital markets expertise, and why should they? Prior to the beginning of globalization, capital.
Based on that, my assumption is he does know his stuff. He alludes to movements in Crimea later on, and we'll keep playing.
The markets weren't really part of the battle space. So the CIA engaged in some outreach. They recruited certain people, myself included, to bring the Wall Street expertise to the agency. This led to something called Project Prophecy. So what the CIA said, well, if there's going to be another spectacular attack, using price signals to determine the actions of participants in the market, whether it be terrorists or strategic rivals of the United States, could you spot it? Could you get the information and actually break up the plot and save American lives?
This system you built with Project Prophecy actually predicted a terrorist attack that was thwarted in 2006.
On August 7, 2006, I got an email from my partner. She said, Jim, we got a bright red signal on American Airlines. So she said, looks like a possible terrorist attack. We documented that. I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning in my study watching CNN, and all of a sudden, MI5 in New Scotland Yard emerged to break up this terrorist attack. They were arresting suspects, removing files. So this showed that the system worked. It's not just good for predicting terrorist attacks, but also strategic attacks by rivals and enemies of the United States.
For years now, you've been helping the Pentagon and CIA prepare for a rise in asymmetric warfare and financial threats. Because today there are immense fears we'll be struck by, as you've described it before, a financial Pearl Harbor.
There's now concern in different branches of the U.S. government. Historically,
A financial Pearl Harbor. So once he explains further how Russia positioned themselves before making any movements in the real world, it might be worth thinking about when you see these large market movements. You see crypto down, you see the equities markets plummeting, you see rates on the rise. What could be coming next? I've got another video after this. It won't be as long though, but I'll let this one play because I thought this adds context to, I guess, the content that I like to talk about.
In Washington, the Treasury and the Fed take care of the dollar. The Pentagon, the intelligence community take care of other threats. But what happens when the dollar is the threat? And Americans generally know that the Fed has increased the money supply.
This is today, 2014 for them. If you pull up the amount of new money that was created in this year alone, it's astonishing. I'll let this keep playing.
By $3.1 trillion. We have $17.5 trillion of debt. We have $127 trillion of unfunded liabilities. What are those?
As at 2014.
Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, student loans, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA. You go through the whole list and it goes on and on and on. There's no way to pay it. During the boom years of the 1950s and 1960s, every dollar of debt that was created, we got $2.41 worth of economic growth. So that was pretty good bang for the buck. But by the stagflation of the late 1970s, that had actually collapsed. So now for a dollar of debt in the late 1970s, we were only getting 41 cents.
There it is. Can you imagine what it is now, beyond 2014, current day, 2022? Makes me wonder why they're trying to make the dollar stronger.
Cents of growth. So obviously that's a huge drop off. You know what that number is today? Today we only get 3 cents of growth for every dollar of debt. So we're piling on the debt, but we're getting less and less growth as that trend goes.
2014.
From $2.41 to 41 cents to 3 cents, it's soon going to go negative. This is a signal of a complex system about to collapse.
This really speaks to what you wrote about in your new book, The Death of Money. The title strongly alludes to this. The hourglass is now empty. You warn we're about to fall into a 25-year Great Depression, that the stock market could plunge almost overnight 70%.
You know, when I use the phrase 25-year depression, it sounds a little extreme, but
they do have plunge protection teams now, so I'm not sure if that's even possible anymore. A 75% plunge, relatively overnight.
But historically, it's not. We had a 30-year depression in the United States from about 1870 to 1900. Economists actually call it the Long Depression. That was before the Great Depression. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1940, so that was quite long. The U.S. is in a depression today.
A lot of folks might disagree with you that we're currently in a depression. That word brings to mind images of the 1930s and soup kitchens.
Well, we have soup kitchens today. They're just at Whole Foods in your local supermarket because 50 million Americans are on food stamps. It's not that we don't have distress. We have enormous distress, but it's being hidden in different ways. The unemployment rate today is actually 23% when you calculate it the right way.
And you point the finger right at the Fed, Congress, the White House.
I actually was in a meeting in the Treasury, and I said to the audience, the Fed and the Treasury are the greatest threat to national security, not...
I keep telling you, the Fed, that's as federal as the Federal Post, is not your friend.
Al-Qaeda, not some of the other threats out there, but right here in this building with this group, you people are destroying the dollar, and it's just a matter of time before it collapses. And I testified before the United States Senate about this. I warned the Senate, you know, maybe we can't stop earthquakes on the San Andreas Fault, but nobody thinks it's a good idea to send the Army Corps of Engineers out there and make the San Andreas Fault bigger. But by money printing and credit creation and reckless monetary policy by the Fed, we're making the San Andreas Fault bigger every day. And when you make a complex system bigger, the risk doesn't go up a little bit, it goes up exponentially. So the risk is unimaginable at this time. The collapse hasn't...
It ratchets up.
happened yet, but the forces are building up, and that's just about to snap.
Your take, and that of many in the intelligence community, is much different than what we're hearing out of Capitol Hill, which is why the allegations you make in this book are causing quite a controversy in Washington.
I was actually at a recent conclave in the Rocky Mountains with a couple central bankers, one from the Federal Reserve and one from the Bank of England. They'll say things privately that they won't say publicly, and I was handed a copy of Janet Yellen's playbook. The Fed is trying to kind of use propaganda.
Janet Yellen, the same one that said they believe inflation is not a problem in 2022. Go figure.
Lie to us about economic prospects, talk about green shoots, use happy talk to try to get us to spend our money. The Fed doesn't know what they're doing. Don't ever think that they know what they're doing. You can print all the money you want, but if people are not borrowing it, if they're not spending it, then your economy is collapsing, even with the money printing. So you can understand it this way. So let's say I go out to dinner and I tip the waiter, and the waiter takes my tip and he takes a taxi cab home, and the taxi driver takes the fare and puts some gas in her taxi cab. Well, in that example, my dollar had velocity of 3. $1 supported $3 of goods and services, the tip, the taxi ride, and the gasoline. But what if I don't feel great and I stay home and watch television, I don't spend any money? Well, that money now has velocity of 0. I leave my money in the bank, but I don't spend it. Let's look at what's actually happening with the velocity of money. It's plunging. It's going down very rapidly. But compare this decline of velocity today to what we saw leading up to the Great Depression. Now, in the depths of the Great Depression, velocity was even lower. But if you compare what's going on today to what happened in the late 1920s, just prior to the Great Depression, there's a very striking resemblance. So it doesn't matter how.
My concerns during these periods, after the economy collapsed, 2 times there was wars that followed. 2 times. World War I and World War II.
How much money the Fed prints. The Fed is trying desperately to bend the curve. Think of it as an airplane that's coming in for a nosedive. It's crashing, getting close to the ground. The Fed's trying to grab the joystick and pull the plane up out of the nosedive and get it back in the air. But unfortunately, it's not working. We're heading for a crash.
We've just covered a lot of these startling numbers, these signals of this coming Great Depression. Let me see if I can quickly put it all together. Nobody denies that we have a debt crisis in this country. But you're saying we can no longer grow our debt without causing our economy to aggressively slow down. We're barely above water now. So that's signal number 1. Signal number 2 is this dangerous slowdown in our velocity of money. It's already plummeting to levels not witnessed since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Are there any other signals the intelligence community is monitoring that suggest?
It's even worse in current day. Even worse.
This collapse is right around the corner?
There are, Steve. There are a lot of signals out there, and they're very, very troubling. One of the ones I'm watching closely, and I know people in the intelligence community focus on also because it covers so much ground. It's called the misery index. The misery index is when you take the unemployment rate and you take the inflation rate and add them together and then just sort of chart that. You look at the misery index today compared to the period of stagflation in the late 1970s and early 80s that Americans remember so well, it's actually worse. This can lead to social instability. Take this back to the Great Depression. The misery index in the Great Depression was at 27, but today it's at 32.89. Believe it or not, it's worse today than it was during the Great Depression. What happens as the depression worsens? Businesses can't pay their debts. The bad losses fall on the banks. The banks ultimately fail. That's happened before. The Fed's there to bail out the banks. What happens when the Fed itself is in jeopardy?
Based on these signals you've been tracking, the Federal Reserve is going to fail?
The Federal Reserve actually in some ways already has failed. I spoke to a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and I said, you know, I think the Fed's insolvent on a mark-to-market basis, and this...
The Federal Reserve Act 1913 and audit the Fed is probably all I want to say there.
Governor first resisted, said, no, we're not. But I pressed her a little bit harder, and she said, well, maybe. And then I just looked at her, and she said, well, we are, but it doesn't matter. In other words, here's a governor of the Federal Reserve admitting to me privately that the Federal Reserve is insolvent, but said, you know, it doesn't matter because central banks don't need capital. Well, I'm going to suggest that central banks do need capital. Look at this chart. What it shows you is that the Fed has increased its capital. It's currently about $56 billion. That sounds good. You say, gee, $56 billion is a lot of money. That's a pretty good capital base. But that's not the whole story. You have to compare the capital to the balance sheet. How much in the way of assets and liabilities is that amount of capital supporting? When you look at that, it's a much scarier picture because the actual liabilities, or debt, if you will, in the Fed's books are $4.3 trillion. So you've got $4.3 trillion sitting on this little skinny capital base of $56 billion. That's very unstable. Prior to 2008, the leverage was about 22 to 1, meaning they had $22 of debt on their books for every $1 of capital. Today, that leverage is 77 to 1. So yes, the capital has increased, but the debt and the liabilities have increased much more.
Your warnings haven't gone completely ignored. In the budget he presented this year, Senator Rand Paul cited your work and how we've driven our economy to the edge of a Roman Empire-like collapse. In fact, we have footage of Senator Paul instructing Americans to listen to your warnings.
Jim Rickards, author of Currency Wars, notes, the Fed is insolvent on a mark-to-market basis. The Fed has wiped out its capital on a mark-to-market basis. Of course, the Fed carries these notes on its balance sheet at cost and does not mark them down to market. But if they did, they would be broke.
First of all, I give Senator Rand Paul a lot of credit. He's one of the people who understands the dangers here. But the problem is not limited to the Fed. It's infecting the private banking system as well. There's about $60 trillion of debt on the balance sheets of our banking system. For a long time, debt in the banks grew at about 2 times the rate of growth in the economy. But lately, this has exploded. Today, it's up to 30 to 1. In other words, for every dollar of economic growth, there's $30 of credit being created by the banking system. The whole thing's unstable. I can give you a very good example of this, and this actually comes from physics. If you had, let's say, a 35-pound block of uranium shaped like a cube, it would actually be fairly harmless. It's what we call subcritical. It's radioactive, but it's kind of tame. But now imagine you engineer it. You take that 35-pound block, you take one piece and shape it into something about the size of a grapefruit. Take another piece, shape it into something like a bat. Put the ball and the bat in a tube and fire them together with high explosives. That sets off a nuclear detonation. That destroys a city. The way it's been shaped and configured is what takes it from what we call subcritical to supercritical.
Jim, are you seeing any signs that our stock market has reached a supercritical state?
Well, unfortunately, yes, we're seeing a lot of signs of this. One of the ones that's really fundamental and really important is the ratio of stock market capitalization.
The thing is, it just keeps going and going. It's 2022.
Into GDP, because you remember the value of all the stocks in the stock market, that's supposed to represent the fundamental economy. It's not supposed to be off in a world of its own. But if you look at what's been happening to that ratio recently, it's going sky high. It's 203%. Prior to the recession, that number was 183%. Go back to the famous tech bubble, the dot-com implosion of 2000. At that time, it was 204%. And if you want the scariest news of all, just prior to the Great Depression, that number was 87%. In other words, the stock market capitalization as a percentage of GDP is twice as high as it was just prior to the Great Depression. So that's a really good metric for saying.
I'm literally getting cold chills right now. Literally.
Is the stock market heading for a crash? All the data says yes, we are. But there's another metric, another warning sign, if you will, that's even more frightening, which is the gross notional value of derivatives. There's a certain number of shares of IBM that are outstanding, but we know what that number is. But there's no limit on the derivatives. I can write options and futures on IBM stock all day long and all the other stocks on the stock.
The derivatives market is about 1 quadrillion currently. That's a shit ton of zeros.
Market. And that's what's been going on. Now, the gross notional value of derivatives in the world today is over $700 trillion, not billion, 700 trillion. That's 10 times global GDP. This collapse is unavoidable. So, we ask ourselves, how bad can this be? Well, what happened in 2007, 2008 when the markets collapsed? We all remember the value of stocks going down, real estate going down, housing going down. All that lost wealth was $60 trillion. The problem is now the system is bigger, so I would expect the lost wealth this time to be $100 trillion, possibly a lot more. We're in this critical state, getting close to the supercritical state where the system implodes. But it takes a catalyst. It takes a flashpoint. There are a number of potential flashpoints I've investigated.
Jim, in a few moments, I want to discuss the steps Americans need.
The straw that broke the camel's back. Think of a couple of things in the last few years that could keep edging us towards the event horizon. Just think.
Need to take with their investments and personal finances to prepare for everything you and your colleagues are predicting. But now let's quickly focus on some of these major flashpoints.
One of the key flashpoints we're looking at is foreign ownership of U.S. government debt. Now, this is a very important thing to understand. We all know that the Treasury has issued over $17 trillion worth of debt. The question is, who buys it? A lot of
After he goes into this, I'll wrap up this particular video and move on to the rest of what I have to say. Basically, building on top of what he's already said.
U.S. debt is owned by foreigners. Who owns it? China, Russia, other countries that are not necessarily our friends, but they can dump it when they want to. Well, guess what? That's actually what's been going on. Recently, foreign holdings of U.S. government debt have been plummeting, but it gets even more interesting.
Imagine having a hostile player within inside the Hex ecosphere. Maybe they want to dump. What happens? Same thing.
Interesting than that. We talked earlier about the project I did for the CIA, Project Prophecy, we said you can see not only market action, but rivals, enemies, terrorists, and others operating in financial markets. So we all know that Russia invaded Crimea in the spring of 2014, and Crimea is now effectively part of Russia. So let's say you're Putin. You know you're going to invade Crimea. You know you want to take over eastern Ukraine. You can expect U.S. financial sanctions. So what do? You basically mitigate the impact of the sanctions. Start dumping treasuries in advance so that when you make your move and the treasury tries to come against you, you've insulated yourself. So now you go back and look at October. Here's Russia dumping treasuries.
I'll put a link to this video in the description. We can see there Russia began dumping treasuries months before the Crimean invasion. It'd be interesting to see an update of this video, current day. There is another video I'll go to next. It explains a tweet that he put out in 2015, which was as follows. Here. So now we know a little bit about Jim Rickards. I thought I would play this particular video, just this little snippet, and the part where he has a particular tweet explaining what could happen, and take note of the date here. It's the 26th of March 2022.
Precedented in its scope and application. And my only point is the effects of this are going to not just last a long time, yes, but they're going to pop up in very, very unexpected places. And Danielle, one thing quickly before we jump into this, obviously, economic sanctions, economic warfare are among my areas of expertise. I've done a lot of it for years, but I do a seminar for kind of mid-career big thinkers in the military run by the U.S. Army War College, but it involves our branch, and I teach the seminar in financial warfare. So it's kind of my topic, but I don't want to overlook the human tragedy and the human cost and the civilian casualties from what's going on in Ukraine. So when I talk about economic effects, I'm not either unaware of that or unsympathetic. We certainly all pray for the victims of this, but that's on the news every night. We get enough of that, but I don't think the economic side of it, which is our subject, is not that well understood.
Yeah, and you're right, or oftentimes it's just kind of brushed aside like, oh, there's economic sanctions, and we don't really understand what that really means. But before we unpack that and really go and take a deep dive there, the beauty of Twitter is that you can look back in history, and there's a tweet of yours that came up from 2015, Jim, because you're talking about how these things don't brew overnight. And back in 2015, this is the soothsayer that you are, you had written or tweeted, Russia is arming Ukraine rebels and U.S. is preparing to arm Kiev. So we'll have a nice little U.S.-Russia proxy war soon, just like #Vietnam. Did you expect anything like this?
I did. Let me make the point. This was there was never a war that was easier to prevent. There's never been a war that's easier to prevent. And there's never been a war that's easier to end. You could end this war in 48 hours or less. Having said that, I did expect that through a series of policy blunders and escalation, in this case, military escalation and political escalation, that this war would take place. And thank you for mentioning that, Danielle. That's from 2015. Go back.
I could listen to this guy talk all day, but that's just me. Currently, we've got, moving on to my take, not as interesting as Jim's, but I still want to talk about it. The war continues on in Russia. Russia blows up the last bridge of a major city in Ukraine. But I thought, didn't you see the news and you got told that Ukraine was going to win this war because clearly Ukraine can overthrow the entirety of the Russian military with all their nukes and their submarines that are like no longer in the ports. I mean, clearly that's what we're being told. We should be for Ukraine and we should provide them with more weapons, pushing us even closer to the event horizon militarily, not financially. Drudge Report has an update, a small update since this morning, and it's saying losing all control of inflation. So remember the Fed? They're not exactly acting in the best interest of yourself. They are coming out and saying, well, you know, people aren't really sure that they can even control this anymore. It might have got away from us just a little bit. Just a little bit. You know, you watched that first video back in 2014, it was stuffed then. Now they keep making it more stuffed, for lack of a better term. And now people are thinking, oh, maybe they won't be able to save us all. We're seeing food prices increase. We're seeing food factories mysteriously get sabotaged. We're seeing shortages. We're seeing fuel going through the roof. And at the same time, we're being told here in Australia, we can't even use a trusted, reliable power plant. We have to shut them all off soon. While at the same time in China, they are actually saying they're reliant on that coal while they do more searching in the deep sea. Record levels. Record depth too, I think, by the way. And they're locking everyone down. Increasing the supply shortage because of the supply lanes. And then we've got the Russia-Ukraine. And then we see the markets crashing. And it's like, which is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back? I wonder. Who's the hostiles? Who's the friendlies? Taking it back to crypto. Crypto winter is here. Is coming. It's here. I would pretty much say it's here. If you listen to Richard Hart, he's an expert in the crypto space. He's predicted something like an $11,000 Bitcoin. Moving on to cryptocurrency, Hex related. Hex created by Richard Hart. It ran up 10,000%. It's pulled back 93%. Okay. The whole of the crypto space is basically ranging from what, 99% in some instances to around 50%. The entire cryptocurrency market is down. It's a bloodbath. Question: which cryptocurrency is more likely to increase by a higher rate? Think about it. You have Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Hex. Not including Pulse-Chain, PulseX, and the forks. The fork of Hex, for example. If you could imagine trying to drive up the price of Bitcoin when everyone in the entire... This is like paraphrasing Richard Hart. When everyone in the entire space has already bought. World's richest man, nation states. Who else is going to buy? Oh, shit. Massive dump. Everyone's lost their money. Except for maybe a few that listened to some calls. Oh, Richard Hart called the top on the day. Thereabouts. I think 2 or 3 days there might have been a slight variance. On the day. The majority of people are probably out of dry powder. I mean, I could be wrong, but how many more world's richest men are there to buy more crypto in these market conditions? We see platforms being crushed, Celsius. We see actual cryptocurrencies, but either through bad actors or people who analyzed their structure and figured out how to exploit it. Meaning that it was just ripe for the picking. These sorts of things are crazy. It's not what crypto was meant for. Not your keys, not your crypto. Before I listened to Richard Hart, I never thought of that phrase. Not your keys, not your crypto. I could barely even sign a transaction on a Bitcoin wallet. I probably still have troubles, to be honest. I was like looking up how to do it. I used to think holding crypto on an exchange, it's no big deal. Then you see what happens now. you can't get your money. They freeze up, they close. Some of them just stop all transactions. Shit. I should have learned from BitConnect. They just pissed off with so much people's money. It's not funny. Then there was other ones after that. Are you kidding me? People still fell for that. Hex can save people, but they've got to first hear about it. They've got to understand how to buy it. They've got to have no expectations. It's you, it's yourself, it's your own choices. Did you decide to buy Bitcoin when it was like basically nothing and hold it till today? Or did you choose not to hear about it? Or any other point between those two spectrums? You know? It's up to you. Is the Federal Reserve going to save you? I'm not even confident the food supply lines are going to be intact the way we once knew. For a long time, we used to live in abundance. I think through the war economy and external forces who do not have the US's intentions at heart, I think these sorts of events are going to make it very hard for the West to continue to thrive the way it once did. I hate to say it. Cryptocurrency might be one of the only ways to become truly financial free, because working a 9-to-5 job in an environment where wages aren't increasing as fast as inflation, and you have insane prices like petrol and food, how are you going to pay for stuff? How are you going to, what if you've got kids, how are you going to feed them? It's a very scary time that we live in. Now this is the comparison. Let's have a look. How much lower could Hex go? Okay. How much lower could Bitcoin and Ethereum go? Once they hit their bottoms, which one is more likely to go higher and give you multiple X's of returns? Bear in mind, Pulse Chain is coming. Bear in mind, Pulse X is coming. I'm trying to tell people Hex is not a scam, and if you took the time to look into it, maybe you don't buy straight away. Maybe you try and time the market. You try and find that bottom point. Maybe it goes down even lower than this. Maybe this is the bottom. I'm either right or wrong. This is what I noticed. Even before I looked into the hedge funds selling at the fastest pace on record, surpassing even the Lehman liquidation spree, although this is zero hedge. If hedge funds are selling at the fastest pace since the Lehman Brothers liquidation spree, what does that tell you about the market? Go back to the initial video we looked at, 2014, the condition of the market back in that time frame. It's been magnified. I think it was last year more money had been printed in that year alone than all the other previous years before. That's insane. That's insane. I haven't got access to this article. Hedge fund selling was never more furious than in the last 2 days. What is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back? What is going to be the things that push us over the event horizon? Now, here's a good one for you. A particular bank that also supports their employees to transition with 6 weeks of annual leave or something like that, or support pay. I'm not sure what that's about. Not just this bank. Around this time here, 6th of the 6th, 5th of the 6th. For some reason, magically the price just tanked, right? Pulled back. Wasn't just this bank, it was all banks across the sector in Australia this is. Following, we've seen big sell-offs. Following, we've seen articles saying hedge funds are pulling out their liquidity, they're selling. Right? So what's happening? To me, I can see a pattern with the bank stock price plummeting relatively, not compared to crypto, but to their normal share price. At the same time, hedge funds have been massively selling. That is about it. I think if we are aware of this, we can at least be prepared for it. Personally, I think I hope not, but long life food might be a thing you may need to consider. Growing your own food, you know? Just making sure you've got your bases covered, moving into the future, should some unpleasant events take place. In all of the entire markets, I cannot see a better instrument to put your finances into. Do you think this is the bottom for Bitcoin? Do you think you're going to be able to make, like, I don't know, an easy 10x? There's figures out there saying how easily Hex can be 10x'd. Was it 100x? I have to go back and check. But yeah, without shilling, if you got in early on Hex, you were able to make some pretty good gains. As Richard Hart says, the two people that get rich in crypto is the founder and early adopters. We're still relatively early in this space. And the fact that Pulse Chain and Pulse X is coming out, a lot of potential upside for Hex. That's all I'm saying. Think about it from a geopolitical point of view. What market are you going to be able to get any sort of yield that's sustainable? When you see other platforms dying, when you see other cryptocurrencies dying, it's just not around. It doesn't exist. If you know about Hex already, you're pretty lucky. If you're hearing about it for the first time, you're extremely lucky. That's all I got to say on this particular matter. All right, signing out.